This morning we're talking about the importance of mentoring. We are in the Old Testament book of 2 Chronicles, and we're going to largely be in chapters 23 and 24. Now, we don't go into 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles very often, but there are some stories there with some lessons that we still need to apply to our lives and to the Lord's church today. And this is the fourth in our series on Stand in the Gap. We've been talking about the good kings of Judah. There weren't very many of them. They had 30 different kings in the southern nation of Judah, and out of the 30, there were only 8 who were remotely good. That means that there were 22 who were evil kings in Judah, with God's people. And out of those 8, there were only 5 that were largely good. And those 5 we're studying right now as we discuss the need to stand in the gap, to be able to make a stand for the cause of God, to be able to seek revival in our church, in our own lives, and in this land. So this is the fourth in our series, Stand in the Gap. Do you like to read or watch a good mystery? I know Kalita turns on some, and I'm thinking, I'd rather watch Murder, She Wrote than some of the real bloody, gory stuff that's out there right now on regular TV. But sometimes she gets it and doesn't want to watch it either. And I'm getting a face. There's a really good mystery in 2 Chronicles 22, 23, and 24. Here in chapter 22, actually, not 23, but in chapter 22, after the death of Joash's father, King Joash, who is the king we're studying today, after his death, there was palace intrigue and there was mystery. Now, as an infant, Joash was the only surviving heir of King David who could be king of Judah. The promise from God was that through David's line, the whole world would be blessed. Jesus was called the Son of David, and Jesus' genealogy can be traced directly back to David, to King David, both through his physical birth mother Mary and through his adopted father Joseph. So on both sides, he could be traced back there, but that would have stopped cold if this intrigue had gotten a footing. Because we see that Joash's enemies wanted him dead. And so enter his mentor. Actually, there were 2 of them, but one stands up as one who guided him in the ways of God, and that was the high priest Jehoiada. We're talking about Joash the king, but we're talking more about the people who took care of the king and made sure that he was able to continue with the promise of God. And the point of this message this morning is that God's people always need good mentors. We all do. I want to show you a picture here, and this picture will be up for a few minutes while I talk about these 2 men. These are 2 of my own spiritual mentors. I have a number of people who have mentored me, who have encouraged me, who have taught me, who have prayed for me. But these 2 are rather outstanding in my mind and in my life. And I want to tell you their stories. First, Bob Mack. On the left side of the screen, at the age of 80, Bob went home to be with the Lord shortly before Christmas. And as a tribute, I wrote the following. I said this: I mentioned that my mentor, Bob Mack, died earlier this week. Today, a friend asked me if I would be attending the funeral visitation and service tonight and tomorrow. Now, this was back in eastern Ohio, and it wasn't possible for me to make that trip on the weekend. I am unable to go due to many responsibilities this weekend and nearly a foot of fresh snow here in the UP. In good weather, it's an 8-hour drive back to Austintown, Ohio, so I wish I was there. My friend asked me about my memories of Bob. And when I was going into the 8th grade, Bob received me during a Friday evening campfire at Elkhorn Valley Christian Service Camp in Burkholz, Ohio. I made a commitment that night to pursue ministry as a career as an 8th grader. And when I was in high school, I worked a couple of weeks for Bob, who we affectionately called Chief, on his maintenance crew at the camp. He had become the camp manager on a full-time basis. Now, one of those weeks, I accidentally broke the handle of his favorite hammer, and I found out after I broke it that it was a hammer his father had given him. But he never said another word about it. I dated 2 of the camp lifeguards that Bob hired, and I actually married one of them. In 1977, Bob delivered the charge or the sermon for my ordination. And I want to show you something. I brought a couple of things that hang on my walls in my office here in the church building. And many ministers have their ordination certificates framed. This is mine from 1977. My father's name is on here. The elders of the Lindkirk Church of Christ in Austintown, Ohio, a church that has now closed its doors. My home church, their names are here. There are names of elders of the church that I first preached in during a summer ministry, the summer that Kalita and I were married. They participated in the ordination service. And there's a couple other names here that are rather important. The one that's most important in that other list is Bob Mack's name. He preached my ordination sermon. He gave me the charge, and it's something I haven't forgotten. His signature is forever with me. Although it's fading, it's forever with me as someone who participated and helped with my call to the ministry. Now, in 2002, jumping ahead a few years, Bob touched my heart with his message at the Lindkirk Church for my mother's memorial service. And just a few years ago, Bob and I shared responsibility in conducting my uncle's funeral service. Last year, during Labor Day weekend, Bob and I spoke at the 60th anniversary celebration for Elkhorn Valley Christian Service Camp in Bergholz, Ohio. And that was the last time I saw Bob. That's when that picture was taken. And the only thing I can say about Bob Mack now, the one thing that is seared in my heart and in my memory, are the words of Jesus. Well done, good and faithful servant. Next, let me talk about Bob Russell, who's pictured on the right with Kalita and with me. While Bob Mack has been in my life since the 1960s, I've heard about Bob Russell for nearly as long, but we only became personal friends in 2007 when I was invited to attend a minister's retreat that Bob and the Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky was sponsoring at their church camp in southern Indiana. At just 22 years of age, Bob Russell became the minister of the Southeast Christian Church in Louisville. And that small congregation of 120 members became one of the largest churches in America, with 18,000 people attending their 4 worship services every weekend in 2006 when Bob retired. By the way, their numbers are up to about 24,000 now today with multiple campuses. It was at that retreat that I attended that Bob showed some slides of people who were part of the congregation in Pennsylvania where he grew up. He mentioned Dorothy Sherrod, who went on to study at Cincinnati Bible Seminary and became a missionary to Alaska. Afterward, I told Bob that my mother, Dorothy, which they called on campus Big Dot and Little Dot, that my mother, Dorothy, and Dorothy Sherrod Haddenham were roommates at Cincinnati, and that the Haddenhams were lifelong friends of my family. It was because of the Haddenhams that Kalita and I moved to Alaska and served the church at Palmer, where the Haddenhams had ministered for so many decades. Now, that mutual connection to Dorothy Sherrod Haddenham established the friendship that Bob Russell and I developed. Bob became more than a friend. He personally mentored me while I endured some hardships. In 2008, Johnson University selected me as their second Eubanks Fellow. I was on campus that spring to talk to the students about the reality of ministry and how to endure through difficult times. Bob was proud of me and said that honor made him feel like he would have felt if one of his own sons had received it. But while I was on campus, behind my back, the elders of that church that I was serving were working to demote me, to effectively remove me from the preaching ministry. Bob was incensed when he found out, and he encouraged me to consider moving on. I stayed at that church for 6 more months. And during that time, I attended a church leaders conference with some of those elders and with the minister they hired to be the preacher. Bob was the featured speaker. When Bob saw me, he interrupted a conversation he was having with others to speak to me. Asking how I was doing, I mentioned that I was there at that conference that day with the elders and my replacement. And Bob paused for a moment and said, "Then maybe I shouldn't mention you and your situation in this morning's message?" And I said, "That would be wise." But I did move on. The next church, though, was really not any better for us. And I actually found myself needing to look for another place to serve just 17 months after I started at that other church. And that is when First Church of Christ in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan came into our lives. Now, Bob and Judy were on an anniversary trip in California at that time, the time that I had sent a resume in, the time the elders expressed a lot of interest in me. And so I called Bob on his cell phone, and I asked if I could use him as a reference. "Sure," he responded. And then I said, "Bob, the church is on a fast track with this. Could I give them your cell number if they wanted to speak to you?" Now, I knew he was on an anniversary trip in California with Judy, but I felt I needed to ask. And there was a pause, and he said, "That would be fine, Tom." Now, the rest is history. At my invitation, Bob and Judy Russell came to Sault Ste. Marie in the fall of 2012. And Bob spoke about leadership, and he spoke on a Sunday morning. And the photo you see up there, with Kalita on one side and with me on the other, was taken by Judy when we visited Tequamanen Falls. These are my mentors. These are people who have helped to give me solid ground to stand on. And so with that in mind, I want us to return to the story of Jedediah, who was the high priest, and he was Josiah's mentor. Now, first of all, when we get back into this Old Testament story, we see that, I said Jedediah. I shouldn't have said Jedediah. Should have said Jehoiada. Back when we get to those stories, we find that Jehoiada was a reformer. And this is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 23. But in order to understand this and appreciate it, we need to back up to this intrigue and this mystery that I talked about at the very beginning. We need to look at 2 Chronicles 22 and starting at verse 10 and reading down just a few verses. It says, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family of the house of Judah. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered, and put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Because Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, and the wife of the priest Jehoiada, was Ahaziah's sister, she hid the child from Athaliah so that she could not kill him. He remained hidden with them in the temple of God for 6 years, while Athaliah ruled the land. Wow. So, a lot of names there. But let's just understand this. We understand that Josiah's father died. And when Josiah's father died, we see that his grandmother wanted to rule Judah. And the only way she could do it would be if she wiped out every other descendant of Josiah so the crown could come to her. And it was Jehoiada's wife who saw the danger there and whisked Joash away at the age of 1 and hid him in the temple in one of the rooms and kept him there safe until he was 7 years old. So we see that Joash, the only surviving heir to the throne of David, was hidden for 6 years. And for 6 years, Jehoiada, the high priest, waited. For 6 years, Athaliah usurped the throne. For 6 years, she led the nation into idolatry and away from God. For 6 years, the priests of Baal, the false, evil, wicked, idolatrous priests, prospered. But still, Jehoiada waited until the time was right. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 23, we are told that in Joash's 7th year, when he was 7 years old, Jehoiada made the move to get him to the throne. He gathered the faithful men of Judah together, and they crowned Joash king at the tender age of 7. Now, we know a 7-year-old can't reign. We know a 7-year-old can't understand the weight and the responsibility that would be on his shoulders to lead a nation. He needed a mentor. And we see that Jehoiada was the mentor for Joash. You look at verses 11 through 15 of chapter 23, so that we don't have to read the entire story. So we pick up, just with that background, at verse 11. And verse 11 says, Jehoiada, this is in chapter 23, Jehoiada and his sons brought out the king's son and put the crown on him and presented him with a copy of the covenant, which is the laws of God, which is the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And they presented him, and they proclaimed him king. They anointed him and shouted, "Long live the king!" Where'd that phrase come from when you hear it around Queen Elizabeth? It comes from biblical times. When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and cheering the king, she went to them at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets, and singers with musical instruments were leading with praises. And Athaliah tore her robes and shouted, "Treason! Treason!" I'm really tripping over my names. Jehoiada, the priest, sent out this command to the units of those who were over hundreds, who were in charge of the troops. He said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest had said, "Do not put her to death at the temple of the Lord." And so they seized her and reached the entrance of the horse gate on the palace grounds, and there they put her to death. Now, we think that sounds awful cruel and awful harsh in our day and age. But that was the kind of ancient justice that was acted upon. That was the way to destroy the influence of those who would lead God's people away from the truth of God. And so we have this evil relative of Joash saying, "He doesn't deserve to be king. I should be queen. Don't listen to him. Listen to me." And so when Joash was put on the throne at the age of 7, we see that Jehoiada was made a regent or a counselor to the nation because he needed a good advisor. He needed someone to mentor. He needed someone who was wise, someone who knew God. We all need that in our lives. And with Jehoiada, we see in verse 16 that the national covenant to God was renewed. Israel was to be the people of God. They were to serve God and God alone. Enough with Baal. Enough with Asherah poles. Enough with false worship. The idolatry and the worship of Baal was destroyed. The Baal's temples and altars and images were shattered by the people. It tells us that sin must be forsaken and overthrown. God must reign supreme over all. And the worship of Jehovah God was restored. That's told for us in verses 18 and 19. There was praise and thanksgiving that filled the courts of God's house, and worship was restored in its ancient purity, in the way it was intended. And the throne of David was established in verses 20 and 21. Joash was elevated to his lawful place as king. Now, the priesthood was also elevated to a higher honor. When Joash was a child, Jehoiada virtually reigned. He reigned because the child could not govern the country. And so just as Samuel elevated the office of the prophet, Jehoiada elevated the office of the high priest. In fact, we are told in chapter 24, in verses 15 and 16, that when Jehoiada died, he was given the greatest honor a priest could ever be given. He was buried not where the priests were buried, he was buried with the kings. Because he understood the need for mentorship. And so we have Jehoiada and his reforms. And then in 2 Chronicles 24, we have Joash and his reign. And there's not a whole lot there to tell us about Joash except these main points. Joash had a heart to repair God's house. He wanted to do it because the evil queen had wanted to destroy it. He sent the Levites to gather an offering of the people, and the people gave gladly to be able to bring this about. And he made a chest for the offering, and that chest was known as Joash's chest. And he repaired God's temple. So we see that Joash, in his reign, did some good things. But ultimately, in chapter 24, our third point is that Joash fell. He had a downfall. There are four things that we're told led to Joash's downfall. As long as Jehoiada was around to guide him, Joash was good. He did the right thing. He wanted to follow God because Jehoiada followed God. But when Jehoiada died, he followed the people. He listened to them. He said, I have to make my people happy, so I'm going to do what they want. Joash started doing evil. He neglected the strongholds. There's a parallel passage in 2 Kings chapter 12 that tells us that the high places were not torn down. What's that mean? When Jehoiada was taking down all of these wicked places of worship, they were being rebuilt quietly. And when Joash became king, he left them alone. He neglected the strongholds. The priests of those idolatrous places started having their influence again on God's people. And they were worshiping false gods on hilltops. They were not worshiping the one true God in his temple. False worship and altars similar to God's altar were being built. They were counterfeiting their faith. And they were wanting to do so. And Joash was allowing it. He surrendered the sacred. In 2 Kings chapter 12, we're also told that he surrendered what should not have been surrendered. When push comes to shove, what comes first? For Joash, he bribed his enemies with things that belonged to God instead of seeking to do things God's way. He knew where the treasury was. He knew the amount of money that was available. He knew about the gold and the silver. And so he started handing it out, trying to appease those or trying to pay his enemies. He ignored God's call to repentance. 2 Chronicles 24, verses 19 through 22 tell us this story. And this is one section I do want to read. 2 Chronicles 24, starting at verse 19, we see, back up here, it says, although the Lord sent prophets to the people to bring them back to him, and though they testified against them, they would not listen. And then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood before the people and said, this is what God says. Why do you disobey the Lord's commands? You will not prosper, because you have forsaken the Lord, and he has forsaken you. But they plotted against him, and by order of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. King Joash did not remember the kindness of Zechariah's father, Jehoiada, that he had shown to him, but he killed his son, who said as he lay dying, may the Lord see this and call you into account. So it was a tough situation. It was a complete turnabout. And it happened because Joash did not heed God's message, but instead he killed the messenger. Now down in verse 25, it talks about Joash's death. It says, when the Arameans withdrew, they left Joash severely wounded. His officials conspired against him for murdering the son of Jehoiada, the priest, and they killed him in his bed. So he died and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Did you get that? Joash was a king. Joash was a descendant of David. It was through Joash's line that Jesus would come. But Joash had turned his face from God so severely that he was not buried with the kings. Jehoiada, a high priest, was buried with the kings. You see, in these Old Testament revivals, the people, not just the leaders, turned their backs on God. Some turned back wholly. I'm sorry, let me say that right. They turned back to God. I jumped ahead of myself there. In these Old Testament revivals, the people, not just the leaders, turned back to God. Some turned to God wholly, some partially, and some not at all. And today, the church still needs people to stand in the gap. We desperately need revival. It's been said that every Christian needs a Barnabas, a Paul, and a Timothy. Let me explain that. I showed you my ordination certificate with Bob Mack's name signed on it. This is a group photo of the mentoring retreat, the ministers' retreat that I attended, sponsored by Bob Mack. And of course, Bob and I are pictured there side by side, just like I was with Bob Russell. Bob Russell and I are there side by side, just as I was pictured side by side with Bob Mack. Every Christian needs three different people in their lives. They need a Barnabas, who was an encourager. They need Paul, who was a teacher. And they need a Timothy in their life, someone they can guide, someone they can direct. That's who Joash had, but that's who he disregarded. Please seek a mentor. Please be a mentor. Why? Because the Scriptures declare it is by our fruit they will know us. It is by who we are and what we say and how we live and who we regard that people will recognize whether we are following God. Would you be a Barnabas to someone? Would you be an encourager? Would you be Paul to someone? Would you be their teacher? Would you be their brother, their sister, one who would walk with them? Would you be a Timothy? Would you recognize the need for someone in your life, someone who is godly, someone who is full of the wisdom of God, who you can bounce things off of, who you can talk to, who, it doesn't matter if the person's younger than you, if they are walking in the ways of the Lord, we need their help. We need their guidance. We need their encouragement. We need their teaching. Barnabas, Paul, Timothy, mentors. Thank God for the mentors in your life. And strive to be one who would mentor others into their relationship with Jesus. We invite you to come to him this morning. We invite you to respond to him this morning, to know that he is the one who gives us all hope and peace. And if you need Christ in your life, we invite you to make the decision to follow him, to obey him, to live for him, and to let him lead through his word, through his Spirit, and through his people, so that you can grow and reach the potential that Christ has for you in him. If you're ready for that, if you're ready to receive him, to be baptized, to follow him, we invite you today to come forward. Let's stand together and let's sing this song.